The Threnody Hive was not a palace in the way softer species understood the word, and it was not a fortress either, though it had broken 3 invasion fleets across its lower terraces in the span of a single generation. It was a grown thing, a vast spiral of secreted resin and load-bearing chitin that had been cultivated over 4 centuries by a lineage of monarchs who understood that a structure which could heal itself could never be truly besieged. Its inner chambers glowed with a cold blue luminescence that came not from lamps but from the architecture itself, from colonies of bioluminescent organisms bred into the walls, until light became a property of the building the way. Hardness is a property of stone. Heat was rationed there. Warmth in the Threnody was a privilege of rank, and the lower ones stood in the great matriarchal order. The colder the air one was permitted to breathe, so that station could be measured in degrees, and a visitor could learn everything about a courtier's importance simply by noting how badly the eyepiece shivered. Into this place of measured cold and inherited light came a single human technician, and the order that governed every breath inside the spiral did not yet understand that it had just admitted the one variable it could not model. He was registered in the arrival manifest as a contract maintenance specialist on loan from a Terran salvage cooperative, 3rd tier, non-diplomatic, expendable. He was, by the reckoning of the Hive, furniture that happened to walk. His name was Merrick Tolles, and he had spent the first 19 years of his life pulling broken machines out of the flooded engine decks of decommissioned ore haulers. And that history had taught him a thing the Threnody had never learned, which was that fear is only useful information, and that a person who treats it as anything more has already begun to lose. The Queen Mother of the Threnody was called Soreth Vale, and she had ruled the spiral for 112 standard years without once raising her voice. She did not need to. Her people, the Vesh, were a species of obligate empaths who read emotional state, the way humans read facial expression, through a dense lattice of chemoreceptive filaments that fringed the long crest of their skulls, and Soreth Vale had cultivated across more than a century a personal atmosphere of such total, frictionless certainty that subordinates frequently agreed with orders she had not yet given. She was tall even for a Vesh, nearly 2.5 meters of pale luminous carapace shot through with veins of living silver, and her eyes were the deep indigo of the void between systems. When she entered a chamber, the chemoreceptive filaments of every lesser Vesh present would still, the way grass stills before a pressure front, and the silence that followed her was not the silence of respect but the silence of prey, holding very still. She had summoned the human to her audience terrace for a single reason, and that reason was not maintenance. The audience terrace occupied the highest habitable ring of the spiral, a vast crescent of polished resin open on one side to the planet's perpetual dusk, where a sun the color of a banked coal hung low over a horizon of black salt flats. Soreth Vale received the human there at the coldest hour, when the terrace temperature had dropped low enough to fog a human's breath, and she watched the small warm-blooded creature walk the length of the crescent toward her with an interest. She was careful to keep out of her filaments. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a man who had been asked to inspect a leaking valve and was mildly curious about the valve. He stopped at the prescribed distance, set down the case of diagnostic tools he carried, and waited, and the absence of fear coming off him registered in the Queen Mother's chemoreceptors as a kind of blankness, a hole in the emotional weather of the room where dread should have been. "You will leave the Threnody," Soreth Vale said. Her translated voice arrived in the human's earpiece a half beat behind the resonant clicks of her actual speech. "Your contract is dissolved. A transport waits at the eastern aperture. You will be aboard it within 1 hour, and you will not return to this system, and you will speak to no one of what you have repaired here." The human absorbed this. He did not argue, did not protest, did not perform the wounded confusion she had watched 100 dismissed servants perform. He simply nodded, once, and reached down to pick up his case, and that easy compliance should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it, because of 3 things the Queen Mother knew, and 1 thing she did not. She knew that the Eastern Aperture transport was not, in fact, bound for the relay station logged in its flight plan. She knew that its true heading was the methane downwell 300 kilometers south, a place from which no decompression had ever recorded a survivor, and she knew that the human had, in the course of repairing the spiral's failing atmospheric exchangers, seen a thing he should not have seen, a sealed lower gallery whose existence appeared on no map of the Hive. The thing she did not know was that her daughter was standing in the doorway behind her and had been standing there long enough to hear all of it. Soreth Vale had borne a single heir in her long reign, a daughter named Issa Vale, and the court regarded Issa as a disappointment so profound it had become a kind of open secret. Nobody was cruel enough, to say aloud. The air was small for a Vesh, barely taller than the human, and her carapace had never developed the silver veining that marked the high lineage, so that she went through the luminous halls of her mother's power looking faded, unfinished, a sketch of a queen rather than a queen. Worse, by the reckoning of the court, was her temperament. Issa Vale did not project. Her filaments were quiet. In a species that ruled through the broadcast of certainty, she had been born unable or unwilling to broadcast anything at all, and the elder courtiers had long ago written her off as a sport of the lineage, a recessive failure who would have to be married into irrelevance the moment her mother could be persuaded to arrange it. What none of them had understood, because none of them had bothered to look, was that an empath who does not broadcast is not necessarily an empath who cannot feel. Issa Vale had spent 26 years in the cold lower rings of her mother's regard, learning the single skill that her station made necessary, which was the skill of reading everything and revealing nothing. She had read her mother's order to the human. She had read the lie folded inside it, and she crossed the terrace and put her body in the doorway through which the human would have to leave. "He stays," Issa said. For 3 full seconds, the audience terrace held a silence so complete that the human could hear the secreted resin of the walls ticking as it cooled. The Queen Mother turned. The filaments along her crest, which had been still, began very slowly to lift, and the chemical pressure of her displeasure rolled across the terrace until the 2 attending guards at the chamber's edge took an involuntary step backward. Issa Vale did not step backward. She stood in the doorway with her unsilvered carapace and her quiet crest, and she did not move. And the human, who could read none of the chemical weather, but could read a stance, understood that the small alien in the doorway had just done something that frightened the guards far more than it frightened her. "You forget yourself," Soreth Vale said. "I forget nothing," her daughter answered. "That is the difficulty. I remember the Eastern Transport's last 3 flight plans. I remember which of them returned. You are not dismissing this technician, Mother. You are disposing of him, and I will not stand in a doorway and let it happen behind my back as though I were furniture, the way you have decided he is furniture." The heir's translated voice was flat, unhurried, almost bored, and the boredom was the most dangerous thing about it, because it meant she had thought this through long before she said it. He repaired the Southern Exchanger array. To do that, he had to enter the maintenance gallery beneath the brood chambers, and you would kill him for what is in that gallery, before you would let him carry the knowledge of it out of the system. I have read you for 26 years, Mother. I am the only person alive who can. Do not insult us both by pretending I cannot read you now. The human stood very still through this exchange and did the thing he had learned to do in flooded engine decks when 2 larger forces were deciding his fate, which was to become small, quiet, and observant, and to begin, without appearing to begin, the work of understanding the machine he was trapped inside. He had not understood, before this moment, that the sealed gallery mattered. He had simply logged it as an undocumented space, the way a salvage technician logs every anomaly, and moved on to the exchanger he had been sent to fix. Now he understood that the gallery was the whole of it. Everything in the room was arranged around the gallery the way iron filings arrange around a magnet, and the small alien in the doorway was the only person willing to say the word out loud. Soreth Vale did not kill the human that hour. She could not, with her daughter's body in the doorway, and her daughter's words already spoken in front of 2 guards whose memories she did not entirely control, and so she did the thing that powerful people do when a direct path is closed to them, which was to choose a longer one. She rescinded the dismissal. She declared, with the frictionless certainty that had ruled the spiral for a century, that the human's contract was extended, that he would remain to complete a full overhaul of the hive's atmospheric systems, and that he would conduct this overhaul under the personal supervision of the heir, Issa Vale, since the heir had taken such a sudden and unbecoming interest in his welfare. She framed it as a punishment for them both. Issa understood it as a sentence. To overhaul the atmospheric systems of the Threnody was to spend weeks crawling through the deepest and most dangerous galleries of the spiral, the unheated lower rings where the air pressure ran wild and the wall colonies sometimes secreted toxins, and Soreth Vale had a great many weeks in which an accident might befall an expendable human and the disgraced daughter who had chosen to stand beside him. The Queen Mother turned back to the banked coal sun, and the audience was over, and the trap had simply changed its shape. In the days that followed, the human learned the spiral the way he had once learned the engine decks, which was with his hands. He learned that the Threnody breathed, that the entire structure was a single distributed organism whose atmospheric exchangers functioned less like machines than like gills, and that the failure he had been contracted to repair was not mechanical wear but something closer to a disease. a slow necrosis spreading through the resin from a source no Vesh engineer had been able to locate. He learned that the lower rings were patrolled by the Sept, an order of warrior, Vesh whose carapaces were grown thick and matte, black, and who regarded the human with a contempt so pure it had a kind of clarity to it. There were 6 of them assigned to the lower spiral, and the human came to know each one the way a man comes to know the specific dangers of an unfamiliar machine. There was Drent, the largest, whose forelimbs had been surgically reinforced until they could shear through structural chitin, and who made a point of being in whatever gallery the human entered, watching, saying nothing, a wall of black carapace and patience. There was Vyas, the tracker whose chemoreceptors were so acute he could follow a scent trail 4 hours cold, and who found the human's emotional blankness personally offensive, a smell that should be there and was not. There was Korathsa, who had lost an eye to a downwell decompression, and replaced it with a salvaged Vesh optic that glowed a faint sullen orange, and who spoke more than the others, and meant less of it. There was the silent one, the infiltrator, a Vesh so small and so quiet that the human worked beside her for 2 full days before he understood she was a separate person, and not a trick of the blue light. Her name, when he finally learned it, was Sen, and she watched him the way a held breath watches a closing door. There was the medic, Olwa, whose forelimbs ended in fine manipulators of surgical delicacy, but whose carapace was the most heavily scarred of all of them, a creature built for both repair and ruin. And there was the leader of the lower sept, a Vesh named Threll, whose augmented vision rendered the world to her as a lattice of heat and motion, and who had been told, in language only slightly more polite than the truth, that if the human and the air did not survive the overhaul, no one would inquire too closely into why. Isavale supervised the work because she had been ordered to, and because the order was a death sentence, she had decided to refuse on her own terms. She did not trust the human. She had no reason to. She had stood in the doorway not to save him but to refuse her mother the convenience of a quiet murder. And those were different things, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. But she watched him work, in the cold lower galleries, in the long unheated hours, and she began to notice the things her court had never been trained to notice. Because her court read certainty, and the human projected none. She noticed that he was never idle. She noticed that when the Sept warrior Drent stationed himself in a gallery doorway to loom, the human worked around him without acknowledgement, the way one works around a structural pillar, and that this absolute refusal to register the intimidation was slowly driving the enormous warrior to a state of baffled fury. She noticed that the human spoke to the spiral itself, low and constant, a running murmur of diagnosis that the translator did not bother to render because it was addressed to no one. And she noticed on the 4th day the thing that changed the shape of everything, which was that the human stopped in the middle of a routine inspection of a structural junction, went very still, and said a single quiet word that the translator rendered as wrong. The junction the human had stopped at was a load-bearing seam where 4 galleries met, and to the Vesh engineers who had certified it for centuries, it was simply a junction, a place where the architecture did what architecture did. The human crouched at the base of it and ran his bare palm along the resin, slow, the way he had once run his palm along the welds of a hull he did not trust. And what he felt under his hand was a vibration that should not have been there, a faint subsonic tremor at a frequency he had spent his childhood learning to fear. On the ore haulers, that tremor had meant a stress fracture propagating through a load-bearing member, the sound a structure makes in the hours before it fails. And the human had learned as a boy that the haulers which made that sound were the haulers that killed the salvage crews who ignored it. He pressed his ear to the cold resin. He counted, and then he stood and told the air, in the flat plain voice of a man reporting a fact, that the entire southern quadrant of the lower spiral was carrying a load it was no longer rated for, that the necrosis spreading through the resin was not a disease but a symptom, and that something below them was eating the structural reserve of the hive from underneath, and had been for a long time, and would bring the southern quadrant down within a season unless it was found and stopped. The Sept warrior Vyas, who had drifted close to listen with the contempt of a specialist hearing an amateur speak, opened his crest to broadcast the dismissal, and then did not broadcast it, because the air had crossed to the junction and put her own quiet hand against the resin, and felt the tremor, and the human watched the alien's faded carapace go from skepticism to stillness in the space of a single held breath. Isavale was not an engineer, but she was an empath, and the spiral was a living thing, and what she felt through her palm was not a vibration but a kind of distress, the low chemical groan of an organism in pain, and she understood in that moment that the human had heard with his hand what no Vesh had been able to, Feel because no Vesh had thought to lay a hand on the wall and simply listen. The human was right. The tracker Vyas, who had been close enough to feel the air's reaction roll off her unshielded for the first time in his life, took the information and went away to verify it, and that was the first crack, the first reassessment, the first time a member of the lower sept did a thing the human had said to do without being ordered to. They found the source 9 days later, and the finding of it was the moment the survival story became something darker. Beneath the southern quadrant, in the sealed gallery the human had glimpsed and the air had named on the terrace, ran a chamber that appeared on no map of the Threnody because it had been deliberately erased from every map. It was a harvesting gallery. The wall colonies that gave the spiral its light and its self-healing resin had been cultivated there in vast tanks, and the resin they produced was not being returned to the structure to maintain it, but drawn off, refined, and shipped, because the self-healing secretion of the Threnody wall colonies was, in the wider markets of the arm, a substance of extraordinary value, a biological compound that could mend the hull of a warship or the wound of a soldier with equal ease. Someone had been bleeding the hive. Someone had been drawing off the structural reserve of the entire spiral and selling it, slowly, carefully for a century, and routing the proceeds through accounts that the human, who could not read Vesh chemical signatures but could absolutely read a manifest, traced in a single evening of quiet work to the personal seal of the Queen Mother. Sorith Vale had not been protecting the Threnody. She had been consuming it. The necrosis was the structure starving, and the human's repair of the atmospheric exchangers had taken him close enough to the harvesting gallery that he had become, without ever understanding it, a witness to the slow murder of an entire civilization by the woman sworn to keep it alive. Issa Vale read the manifest over the human's shoulder, and the human, who had learned to read her stillness the way she had learned to read his, watched 26 years of cold lower ring exile resolve into a single terrible clarity behind her indigo eyes. She had always known her mother was dangerous. She had not known her mother was the wound. The air said nothing for a long time, and then she said the only thing that mattered, which was that the southern quadrant held the brood chambers, that 10,000 Vesh young slept in the warm dark below the failing junction, and that when the quadrant came down, it would not be an accident the Queen Mother regretted, but a clearance the Queen Mother had perhaps been counting on, a way to collapse the evidence of a century's theft under the cover of a structural tragedy that no one would ever think to blame on the monarch who wept the loudest at the funeral. The human looked at the load reading on his diagnostic, he looked at the air, and he said that they had 11 days, maybe 12, before the junction failed on its own, and that whatever they were going to do, they were going to have to do it before the wall came down on its own schedule, because the wall did not care about manifests, and the wall did not care about queens. The 11 days that followed were the crucible, and they were the days in which the lower sept stopped being the human's executioners, and became, one careful reassessment at a time, his crew. It did not happen through speeches. It happened through work. The human needed Drent's reinforced forelimbs to shear away the necrotic resin from the failing junction so the structure could be braced, and Drent, who had been stationed in his doorways for weeks to loom and intimidate, found himself one cold hour being handed a diagnostic reading and a precise location and being asked, not ordered, to cut exactly here and exactly this deep and not a millimeter further, because a millimeter further would breach the brood chamber wall. The enormous warrior cut exactly there. He cut exactly that deep, and when he stepped back and the human checked the cut and gave him a single short nod, the nod of one tradesman to another, something shifted in the black carapaced warrior that he could not have named and would not have admitted, which was the discovery that being useful felt different from being feared, and that he preferred it. The human did not notice the shift, or appeared not to, and that not noticing was its own kind of gift, because it let the warrior keep his pride while he changed his mind. The tracker Vyas found the human a new vibration on the 3rd day of bracing, a second stress harmonic running through the eastern wall, and brought it to him unprompted. The way a junior crewman brings a senior crewman a reading, and the human took it seriously and they traced it together, and it was real and they braced it too. The medic Olwa, watching the human work without rest until his hands shook from the cold of the unheated galleries, did the thing her training had built her to do and could not stop herself from doing, which was to bring the small, warm-blooded creature a heated compound she had synthesized for Vesh hypothermia, and was not certain would not poison him, and to set it down near him without a word, and to watch from across the gallery as he picked it up, tested it against the back of his hand the way she had not expected him to know to do, found it tolerable, and drank it. It was the first warm thing the spiral had given him. He did not thank her, because thanking her would have made it a transaction, and he understood without being told that she had not done it as a transaction. He simply drank it and worked, and the next cold hour the compound was there again, and the hour after that, and the medic Olwa never once acknowledged that she was the one leaving it, and the human never once asked. The silent one, Sen, watched all of this for 11 days and said nothing, and the human worked beside her in the deepest galleries where the infiltrator's small size made her the only sept who could reach the failing seams in the narrowest crawls, and the two of them developed across those days a wordless working language of hand signals and shared silences that was more intimate than any conversation in the spiral. Sen was the one who had been least willing to revise her model of the human because Sen's entire life was the reading of threats. And a creature she could not read was, to her, the most dangerous thing in the world. She had spent 11 days waiting for the human to reveal the hidden aggression she was certain a creature this calm must be concealing. And on the 11th day, in the narrowest crawl of the failing junction, with the structure groaning around them and the load reading climbing toward the number past which the wall would come down, she found out what the human had been concealing, which was nothing. There was no hidden aggression. There was no secret hunger. There was a man who had decided that 10,000 sleeping children were worth more than his contract and his safety and his own life, and who had made that decision so completely and so quietly that he had never once thought to broadcast it, because to him it was not a decision at all, but simply the obvious arithmetic of a person who had been raised to pull broken things out of the dark and fix them. Sen read that, finally, in the narrow crawl, with no shielding between them, and the reassessment that ran through her was so total that she went still in the dark, and the human felt her go still, and put a hand on her small carapace in the universal gesture of "Are you with me?" And the infiltrator who had been waiting 11 days to find his hidden knife felt instead the warmth of his bare human palm against her cold shell, and understood that the warmth was all there had ever been. The junction failed on the 10th day, not the 11th. The wall did not honor the human's estimate because walls do not, and the southern quadrant gave its first true groan 4 cold hours before the brace array was complete, and what followed was the genuine crisis toward which the entire structure had been building. The load reading spiked. A primary load-bearing seam above the brood chamber sheared, and the resin began to come down in slabs the size of transport hulls, and the chemical broadcast of pure terror that rolled off the Sept warriors in that moment was the first time the human had ever felt the lower spiral's emotional weather, because for the first time the warriors were too frightened to shield it. Threll, the Sept leader, ordered an immediate evacuation of the lower rings, which was the correct order, the order any commander would give, the order that would have saved the Sept and abandoned the brood. The human did not obey it. He had no rank to disobey. He simply did not leave, and the air did not leave, and into the falling dark of the collapsing quadrant, the human did the thing he had been preparing to do for 11 days, without telling anyone he was preparing it, which was to use the one technique from his childhood that no Vesh engineer would ever have conceived, because no Vesh had grown up pulling flooded ore haulers off the seabed. On the haulers, when a hull began to fail under pressure, you did not try to hold the whole structure, because the whole structure could not be held. You found the single load path that mattered, the one member through which the entire weight of the failure would route, and you sacrificed everything else to reinforce that one path, and you let the rest come down in a controlled collapse that bled off the energy of the failure in a direction that killed no one. The human had spent 11 days not bracing the whole junction but mapping its single load path, and now, in the falling dark, he called the directions out, and the lower sept executed them, not because they had been ordered to, but because in 11 days the human had become the person whose directions you followed when the wall was coming down. Drent sheared the secondary members on the human's call, dropping them deliberately to redirect the load. Vyas read the propagating fractures and called the next failure half a second before it happened, the half second that let them move. Olwa held the brood chamber seal with her own reinforced forelimbs while the controlled collapse routed the failure around it. Sen carried the final brace into the narrowest crawl, the one only she could reach, and set it on the human's mark, and the load path took the weight and held. And the southern quadrant came down everywhere except the one place it could not be allowed to come down, and 10,000 Vesh young slept through the death of their nursery's outer rings and did not wake. The human stood in the settling dust of a controlled collapse that no Vesh would have believed possible, and the air stood beside him, and the lower sept stood around them both, and not one of them said a word, because the silence said everything that the chemical weather, finally unshielded, was already saying. The reckoning with Soreth Vale came in a separate beat, as such reckonings must, away from the dust of the broodchambers and the exhausted warriors. The Queen Mother had not counted on the quadrant being braced. She had counted on it coming down whole, on the structural tragedy that would have buried a century of theft and an inconvenient witness and a disappointing daughter in a single grief the whole spiral would have mourned. Instead, the quadrant had held. The harvesting gallery had been exposed in the controlled collapse that opened the lower rings to inspection, and the manifest the human had traced to the monarch's personal seal had been copied, before the collapse, into the keeping of the one, Vesh in the spiral, whose stillness the Queen Mother had never bothered to read. Issa Vale brought the manifest to the High Court not as an accusation but as a structural report, a dry recitation of load readings and resin volumes and shipping records, and she let the numbers do what numbers do, which is to say the thing that no one can shield against. The court read the manifest. The court read the Queen Mother's filaments as she heard it read. And for the first time in 112 years, the frictionless certainty of Soreth Vale cracked in public, and a chamber full of empaths felt their monarch's composure curdle into the specific chemical signature of a predator that has just understood it is cornered, and that signature, broadcast involuntarily to every Vesh in the room, was a confession more total than any words. What became of her after that was decided by the court and by the lineage, and by laws older than the human species, and the human was not present for it, because it was not his to witness and because he had a wall to finish bracing. The human stayed. No one had asked him to, and his contract had been dissolved and reinstated and rendered meaningless by everything that had happened beneath it, but the southern quadrant needed a full season of structural rehabilitation, and the human was the only person alive who understood the technique that had saved it, and so he stayed, and he taught. He taught Drent to read a load path. He taught Vyas to lay a palm against the wall and listen with his hand for the tremor that the chemoreceptors could not catch. He taught Olwa the human field repair methods that paired with her surgical precision until the medic could brace a failing seam as cleanly as she could close a wound. And in the cold lower galleries that had been built to measure station in degrees of shivering, the human and the lower sept worked through the long rehabilitation in a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, the warmth of a crew that had decided, without ever taking a vote on it, that one of them was warm-blooded, and that this was simply a fact about the crew, and not a problem with it. Issa Vale came to the southern quadrant in the last cold hour of a long working day, when the rehabilitation was nearly complete and the spiral around them had stopped groaning and begun, slowly, to heal. The wall colonies, no longer bled, had begun to return their secretion to the structure, and the resin of the southern quadrant glowed a fraction brighter each day as the hive remembered how to mend itself. The air found the human at the load-bearing junction where 11 days and a controlled collapse and the future of 10,000 children had all turned on the tremor he had heard with his hand, and she stood beside him in the blue light, and neither of them spoke, because they had both learned the same lesson from opposite directions, which was that the things that matter most are the things that do not need to be broadcast. The court had begun, in the careful way of empaths, to revise its model of the air, because a daughter who could bring down a 100-year monarch with a dry recitation of load readings was not, after all, a sport of the lineage, and the silver veining of the high carapace was beginning, late and slow, to appear in Issa Vale's faded shell, as though her body had simply been waiting for her to become the thing she had always been. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. There were a great many things by then that the two of them did not need to mention. The human had brought a small flask up from the maintenance levels, a battered thing he had carried since the ore haulers, and inside it was a portion of the heated compound, the medic Olwa, still left for him in the cold galleries, and would not admit to leaving, and he had warmed it against a structural heat bleed, and he held it now in his bare human hands in the cold blue dark. Issa Vale watched him hold the warm thing in the cold air, the small steam rising off it the only motion in the still gallery, and the human, without looking at her, without ceremony, without a word, turned his wrist and offered her the flask. It was not a grand gesture. It was the smallest thing in the world. But the Vesh did not share warmth across station, had never shared warmth across station, because warmth in the Threnody was a privilege of rank, and to offer it was to say a thing about the order of the world, that the order of the world did not permit to be said. The air looked at the flask. She looked at the small, warm-blooded creature who had walked the length of her mother's terrace without fear and stayed in a falling quadrant without rank and rebuilt a dying spiral without being asked, and who was now offering her a sip of warmth in the coldest ring of a hive that measured her worth in degrees of cold. And Issa Vale, daughter of Soreth Vale, heir to the Threnody, who had stood in a doorway 26 years into a life of quiet exile and refused her mother the convenience of a murder, reached out one unsilvered hand that was beginning at last to silver, and took the flask and drank. The steam rose between them in the cold blue light. Neither of them said anything. Across the gallery, in the doorway where the warriors of the lower sept had once stationed themselves to loom, Sen stood watching, and did not loom, and her small, quiet crest, which had spent 11 days reading the human for a knife that was never there, lifted by a single degree in something that was not a threat assessment at all. And then she turned and went back to her work, and left the two of them alone with the warm thing passing between their cold hands, and the spiral healing slowly around them all, remembering, ring by luminous ring, how to hold its own weight.